The mall is wrong before anything happens. Fluorescent lights hum too loudly. Mannequins stand at angles that make you double check they haven't moved. The escalator rises into darkness that shouldn't exist in a shopping center at closing time. Heather Mason walks through the space with her hands in her pockets, 17 years old and already tired in ways that have nothing to do with the late hour. She doesn't know yet that this is the last normal moment she'll ever have. She doesn't know that the bathroom mirror is about to crack open and spill her into a world where rust bleeds through porcelain and the walls breathe with biological wrongness. She doesn't know that her father is already dead, murdered while she browsed stores and tried to feel like a normal teenager. But somewhere deep in her psyche, buried under 17 years of constructed identity, Alessa Gillespie knows exactly what's coming. And that knowledge, that fragmentary awareness she can't quite access, is already fracturing Heather's mind in ways that will only get worse as the night unfolds. Silent Hill 3 tells the story of a girl who is three people simultaneously. She's Heather Mason, the daughter Harry raised after escaping Silent Hill 17 years ago. She's Cheryl Mason, the 7-year-old who merged with her other half in the first game's conclusion. And she's Alessa Gillespie, the psychic child who was burned alive by her mother's cult, who split her soul to escape the agony, who has been trying to die for decades but keeps getting resurrected by forces that won't let her rest. Heather carries all three identities in one body, and the psychiatric consequences of this metaphysical horror create a diagnostic profile unlike anything else in the franchise. Tonight we're examining every mental disorder present in Heather Mason's psychological landscape, from the dissociative identity fragmentation that tears at her sense of self, to the complex PTSD she inherited from Alessa's torture, to the acute grief disorder triggered by Harry's murder, to the psychotic features that emerge as repressed memories surface, to the paranoid ideation and hypervigilance that define her journey through a town that wants to use her body as an incubator for a god she doesn't believe in. This isn't about diagnosing a video game character for academic exercise. This is about understanding how Team Silent created horror from authentic psychiatric suffering, how they portrayed fragmented identity with devastating accuracy, and how Heather's mental deterioration across one nightmare-soaked night demonstrates what happens when trauma isn't just remembered, but literally lived inside your DNA. If you're drawn to this kind of deep analysis, go ahead and hit that like button to help other horror fans discover this video, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. Get comfortable, find your favorite spot, and let's descend into Heather Mason's fractured mind. The central horror of Heather's existence is that she doesn't know who she is, not in the typical adolescent sense of searching for identity, but in the literal psychiatric sense that her identity has been constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed multiple times, and the person she believes herself to be is simultaneously true and false. Dissociative identity disorder typically develops from severe childhood trauma, where a child's psyche fractures into distinct identities as a survival mechanism. What Heather experiences is something more metaphysically complex but psychiatrically similar. She literally is multiple people whose consciousnesses have been merged through supernatural means, creating a psychological state where memories, traumas, and identities that don't belong to the person she thinks she is constantly threaten to surface. When the game begins, Heather has no conscious access to Alessa's memories. Harry never told her the truth about where she came from, about what happened in Silent Hill 17 years ago, about the fact that she's the reincarnation of a soul that was split, merged, then reborn. He gave her a new name, a new life, a constructed identity meant to protect her from the order's reach. But you can't erase trauma written into the soul itself, and throughout the game, Heather experiences what psychiatrists call intrusive memories, except these memories aren't from her life. They're from Alessa's childhood, from the ritual that burned her, from the hospital where she lay in agony for 7 years, from the school where she was bullied, from the places where her suffering was so profound it literally reshaped reality. These intrusions create cognitive dissonance that should shatter Heather's sense of self entirely. The certainty that these memories are hers colliding with the knowledge that they can't be because she's never experienced these events. The psychiatric term for what Heather experiences is dissociative amnesia, with a dissociative fugue state that's beginning to collapse. She's lived 17 years with constructed memories and a false baseline identity, Harry Mason's daughter, who grew up in Portland, who likes shopping and has normal teenage concerns. But that identity was built on suppressed knowledge of her true origin, and as the game progresses and the order forces her to confront her nature, the amnesia breaks down. She starts remembering things she shouldn't know. She recognizes places she's never been. She feels emotions tied to trauma she never experienced. Rage at Claudia for betrayals that happened to Alessa. Fear of her mother Dahlia, who was never Heather's mother. Hatred for the order whose rituals scarred a body Heather doesn't currently inhabit but somehow remembers inhabiting. This is dissociation collapsing in real time, the protective barrier between identities breaking down until Heather can no longer maintain the fiction that she's only herself. The moment in the chapel where Claudia reveals the truth represents the diagnostic crisis point. Heather learns that her father lied to her, that her entire life has been a constructed safety, that she's the reincarnation of someone who suffered unimaginable torture, that a god is gestating inside her body whether she consents or not. Most people receiving this information would experience an acute psychotic break. The revelation is too massive, too reality-shattering to integrate into a functional worldview. Heather's response is rage, immediate, volcanic anger that overrides the existential horror of what she's learning. This rage is clinically significant. It's not a healthy emotional response, but a defensive one. By focusing on fury at Claudia, at the order, at the people who killed her father and ruined her life, she doesn't have to process the deeper psychological horror of her own non-existence as the person she believed herself to be. The anger is a wall against dissociative collapse, and it works, keeping her functional through circumstances that should render her catatonic with identity crisis. Until you realize that rage, this intense, this all-consuming, isn't sustainable, and the crash that follows will be catastrophic. Heather's anger carries her through the hospital, through the church, through confrontations with Claudia and Vincent and Leonard, but anger is a high-energy emotional state that burns through psychological resources rapidly. The game never shows us what happens to Heather after the ending, after she's killed the god and escaped Silent Hill, after the adrenaline fades and she's left alone with the knowledge of what she is. That absence is diagnostically telling, because the aftermath of this kind of trauma, this kind of identity revelation, doesn't resolve with a final boss fight. Heather will spend years processing the integration of Alessa's memories, learning to live with the knowledge that she's simultaneously herself and someone else, that her father's love was real but her life was a constructed lie, that she carries the suffering of a child who was burned alive inside her psychological structure. The dissociative barriers that kept her functional are gone, meaning she'll have full access to Alessa's trauma. And PTSD doesn't ask permission before it surfaces. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder becomes Heather's inheritance from Alessa. She didn't experience the abuse herself, but the memories are hers now, encoded somehow in the soul that transferred between bodies. Alessa's trauma was chronic, pervasive, and inflicted by the people who should have protected her. Her mother Dahlia orchestrated her immolation. The order performed the ritual. Her classmates bullied her for being different. She grew up in an environment of total betrayal, where every authority figure and peer group was either actively harming her or passively allowing her suffering. This created in Alessa what it creates in all chronic abuse survivors: a shattered ability to trust, a pervasive sense of danger, a belief that the world is fundamentally hostile and that she deserves the pain inflicted on her. These core beliefs don't disappear when a soul reincarnates. They're baked into the psychological structure, and as Heather's amnesia breaks down, she inherits them. The hypervigilance Heather displays throughout the game reflects this inherited PTSD. Watch how she moves through environments, constantly scanning, checking corners, weapon always ready. This isn't just good survival horror gameplay mechanics. It's an accurate portrayal of how PTSD affects threat perception. People with complex trauma develop exquisitely sensitive threat detection systems because their survival once depended on predicting when abuse would occur. Heather moves through the other world like someone who knows on an instinctive level that danger is always present, that relaxation means vulnerability, that she can't trust the environment to remain stable. Her internal monologue when examining objects shows this too. She's constantly making dark jokes, using gallows humor to manage anxiety, keeping her internal dialogue running to avoid the silence where traumatic memories might surface. This is an avoidance behavior, one of the core symptom clusters of PTSD. By filling the silence with sarcasm and commentary, she's preventing herself from experiencing the full weight of what's happening to her. The other world transitions themselves function as environmental triggers for Heather's emerging PTSD. Each shift from normal reality to the rust, blood, and flesh nightmare represents her repressed memories surfacing. Alessa's suffering made architectural. The hospital otherworld is particularly diagnostic. It's not just scary, it's specifically designed around medical trauma. Alessa spent 7 years in Alchemilla Hospital after the ritual, her body so burned that death would have been merciful, kept alive by her own psychic powers in a prison of pain. The hospital otherworld that Heather experiences contains examination rooms that have become torture chambers, medical equipment transformed into instruments of violation, nurses who exist as faceless, judgmental presences. This is Alessa's trauma geography, and Heather's ability to navigate it, to somehow know where to go despite never having been there, demonstrates that the trauma memories are guiding her even before she consciously accesses them. She's experiencing what clinicians call somatic memory, where trauma is stored in the body and nervous system rather than conscious recall, creating knowledge without awareness of possessing that knowledge. The monsters Heather encounters reflect her fragmenting psychological state with disturbing precision. The closer, that creature made of a woman's legs and torso split open vertically with the inner flesh exposed, represents both sexual trauma and bodily violation. Themes tied to the forced pregnancy Alessa endured when the Order impregnated her with their god. Heather has inherited this trauma of reproductive violence, the memory of her body being used as an incubator against her will, and the closers literalize that violation. Their behavior, lurching forward with legs spread in a parody of birth position, makes the symbolism inescapable. Heather is being hunted by manifestations of reproductive horror. Her own body's capacity for pregnancy turned into a weapon against her. This creates a specific form of anxiety around bodily autonomy, a fear that her physical form will betray her, that the God gestating inside her will emerge regardless of her resistance. It's a loss of control over her own flesh, and that loss creates the kind of psychological horror that can trigger dissociation as a protective mechanism. The missionaries, those humanoid figures wrapped in straitjacket-like bindings, represent Heather's inherited trauma of institutional confinement and forced compliance. Alessa was trapped, first by her injuries, then by the Order's rituals, held in place and used for purposes she couldn't escape. The missionary's complete facial obscurity, wrapped so thoroughly that no features remain visible, reflects dehumanization, the erasure of identity that occurs when someone is reduced to a function rather than treated as a person. Alessa was never seen as a child deserving of protection. She was the vessel, the chosen one, the tool for the Order's salvation. Heather inherits this fear of being depersonalized, of being valued only for what her body can produce, rather than who she is as a human being. The pendulums those creatures formed from multiple female bodies merged and hanging from ceiling-mounted frames might represent Heather's psychological fragmentation most directly. Multiple bodies fused into one malformed entity, none of them complete, none of them individual, all of them trapped in a configuration that shouldn't exist. This is Heather's internal state made flesh, Cheryl, Alessa, and Heather trying to coexist in one body, none of them fully present, all of them incomplete. The fusion creating something that functions but is fundamentally wrong. The pendulums attack by swinging their lower bodies violently, a motion that's simultaneously sexual and violent, birth and death combined into one grotesque action. They're Heather's fear that the merging of her identities has created something monstrous, that she's no longer viable as a person but has become a psychiatric chimera. Memory's ghost, that boss fight against a manifestation of Alessa's suffering, represents the traumatic core that Heather cannot defeat through violence. You can hurt it, can drive it back temporarily, but you cannot kill a memory. Trauma doesn't die when you fight it. It retreats and resurfaces, an endless cycle of intrusion and suppression. The fact that memory's ghost appears in multiple locations, that it keeps returning despite being defeated, mirrors how PTSD symptoms recur, how flashbacks and intrusive thoughts don't respect narrative resolution. Heather can progress through the game, can move forward physically, but the trauma follows her, manifesting again and again until she completes the ritual that will either allow the God to be born or give her the power to destroy it. The God itself, when it finally manifests after Heather uses the aglaophotis her father left her, the red liquid in the pendant that forces the fetus from her body in one of the most viscerally disturbing sequences in horror gaming, represents the culmination of inherited trauma trying to take autonomous form. Heather has been carrying this entity inside her since reincarnation, a parasite of divine suffering that wants to be born into a world it will reshape into paradise through apocalypse. The God is Alessa's pain given will and form, the suffering of a burned child amplified through mystical belief into a force that believes its salvation. When Heather fights it, she's fighting the part of herself that believes suffering is meaningful, that pain has purpose, that there's redemption in agony. This is the core delusion that abuse survivors often struggle with, the belief imposed by abusers that the suffering served a purpose, that it meant something, that it was necessary. The Order taught Alessa that her pain was holy, that her burning was required for humanity's salvation, and that belief gestated inside her psyche for 17 years until it became this monstrous deity. Heather's rejection of it, her refusal to let it be born, represents a psychiatric breakthrough. She's refusing the narrative that her suffering has meaning beyond the cruelty of those who inflicted it. The diagnostic picture so far includes dissociative identity disorder, or a supernatural equivalent, complex PTSD inherited from Alessa's chronic abuse, hypervigilance and exaggerated startle response, intrusive memories and flashbacks to traumas she didn't personally experience, and avoidance behaviors manifesting as dark humor and constant internal monologue. But we haven't yet addressed the grief, and grief is what transforms Heather from a confused teenager trying to understand her nature into someone capable of violence. Harry Mason's death represents the loss of Heather's only anchor to stable identity. He was the one person who knew the truth about her origin and loved her anyway, who treated her as Heather rather than as Alessa's reincarnation or the Order's vessel. His murder, stabbed through the chest by the missionary, a cult member transformed into a blade-wielding monster by Claudia's power, doesn't just deprive her of her father, it destroys the foundation of her constructed identity. If Harry is gone, then the life he built for her, the protection he provided, the normalcy he tried to give her, all of it becomes retroactively fragile. She learns about his death from Claudia in the chapel, delivered as casual cruelty, and Heather's response is immediate dissociation followed by explosive rage. The dissociation comes first, a moment where she goes still and silent, where her brain is trying to process information too devastating to integrate. Then the rage erupts, and it's not just anger, but a fundamental shift in her psychological state. Before Harry's death, Heather was reactive, defending herself, trying to escape. After learning he's been murdered, she becomes proactive, hunting Claudia with intent to kill. This shift indicates acute grief disorder, progressing into a revenge fixation that overrides self-preservation. Acute grief disorder, recently added to diagnostic manuals as prolonged grief disorder, occurs when the normal grief process becomes pathological, when the loss is so profound that the person cannot function, cannot accept the death, cannot move forward. Heather doesn't have time for normal grief processing. She learns her father is dead and immediately has to continue fighting for survival, which means her grief has no outlet, no space to be experienced and integrated. Instead, it transforms into rage, and that transformation is a defense mechanism. Grief is vulnerable, overwhelming, an emotion that requires safety and time to process. Rage is active, empowering, an emotion that can be weaponized. By converting her grief into fury, Heather stays functional, but the cost is that she's not actually processing the loss. She's postponing it, and the psychological bill for that postponement will come due eventually. The revenge motivation that drives the latter half of the game is diagnostically concerning. Heather states explicitly that she's going to kill Claudia, that she's going to make the Order pay for what they've done. This isn't justice-seeking or self-defense, it's vengeance, a fixation on inflicting harm as retribution for harm received. Revenge fixations can become pathological when they override all other considerations, when the person becomes so focused on retribution that they lose sight of their own well-being, their own survival, their own future beyond the act of revenge. Heather walks into the Order's stronghold knowing it's likely a trap, knowing Claudia wants her there, and she goes anyway because killing Claudia has become more important than staying alive. This is suicidal ideation masked as revenge, a death wish disguised as righteous anger. The game never explicitly addresses whether Heather is suicidal, but the behavioral evidence suggests passive suicidal ideation at minimum. She takes enormous risks, walks into obviously dangerous situations, and shows minimal concern for her own safety beyond the immediate tactical requirements of survival. When Douglas offers to help her, offers her a way out, she refuses and continues alone into greater danger. This isn't bravery. It's someone who doesn't value her own survival above the goal of making her enemies suffer. Passive, suicidal ideation doesn't mean planning to kill yourself. It means not caring whether you live or die, being willing to accept death if it comes, even unconsciously seeking situations where death becomes likely. Heather's journey into the Order's church is tactically foolish, strategically unsound, and only makes psychological sense if we understand her as someone whose grief has become a death drive. The confrontation with Claudia in the chapel reveals the full extent of Heather's psychological deterioration. After Heather expels the god using the Aglaophotis, Claudia retrieves the aborted fetus and swallows it herself, becoming the new vessel. Her body immediately begins destroying itself, blood pouring from her mouth and nose, her flesh failing as the incomplete divine fetus consumes her from within, forcing its birth through a body unprepared and unwilling. Heather watches this and feels no pity, no horror at the grotesque death unfolding before her. She's emotionally numb, shut down, experiencing what psychiatrists call flat affect, where appropriate emotional responses don't occur. This numbness is a dissociative symptom, a protective shutdown that occurs when emotions become too intense to process. Heather has reached her psychological limit. Grief and rage and horror all exceeded her capacity to feel, so her nervous system has simply stopped producing emotional responses. She watches Claudia die with the same expression she uses to examine a locked door, complete detachment from the magnitude of what's occurring. The god's birth from Claudia's body represents the externalization of Heather's internal state. Suffering becomes incarnate, trauma takes physical form, and it has to be destroyed because it cannot be integrated. Heather cannot accept the god, cannot let it exist, because accepting it would mean accepting that her suffering had meaning, that Alessa's torture served a purpose, that the order was right. Her rejection is psychologically necessary, even if it's religiously and metaphysically complicated. She kills the god not just to prevent apocalypse, but to kill the part of herself that believes pain is sacred, that trauma is transformative, that there's redemption in agony. It's the most important psychiatric act she performs in the entire game, refusing to let her suffering become mythology. But what happens after? The game ends with Heather leaving Silent Hill, but it doesn't address the aftermath. She's just experienced severe psychological trauma across approximately 12 hours, learned her entire identity is constructed, discovered her father is dead, killed multiple people and creatures, vomited up a god, and destroyed the literal incarnation of her inherited trauma. The psychiatric fallout from this will be catastrophic. She has no support system now that Harry is gone, no therapist who would believe her experiences, no framework for integrating what's happened to her into a functional worldview. She's 17 years old with complex PTSD, acute grief disorder, dissociative identity fragmentation, and probable major depressive disorder developing in the aftermath of sustained trauma. The survival instincts that kept her alive through the night will fade, and when they do, she'll be left with the full weight of everything she's endured. Post-traumatic stress disorder will manifest in nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance that makes normal life impossible. She'll startle at sudden movements, avoid places that remind her of the other world, which might be most public spaces since the other world manifested in a mall, a hospital, an office building, ordinary locations corrupted into horror. She'll have intrusive thoughts about her father's death, about Claudia's body splitting open, about the sensation of the God moving inside her before she expelled it. These intrusions will come without warning, triggered by sensory details she can't predict. A certain quality of fluorescent light, the smell of rust, the sound of metal scraping metal. PTSD doesn't respect narrative closure. It continues long after the story is supposed to be over. The dissociative symptoms will complicate her recovery. She now has access to Alessa's memories, but integrating those memories into a coherent sense of self is work that takes years of therapy under ideal circumstances, and Heather's circumstances are far from ideal. She'll experience episodes where she's not sure if she's Heather or Alessa, moments where the boundaries between identities blur and she loses track of which memories are hers, which timeline she's currently inhabiting. This is dissociative identity disorder, even if the mechanism is supernatural rather than purely psychological. She has multiple identity states, each with distinct memories and affects, and learning to function as a unified person requires integration work she has no resources to accomplish. The grief will surface once the immediate danger passes, once she's no longer in survival mode and has time to feel the loss. Prolonged grief disorder is characterized by intense yearning for the deceased, preoccupation with thoughts of the person who died, and inability to accept the death even months or years later. Heather will likely experience all of these. Harry was her entire family, the only person who knew her completely, and his death leaves her utterly alone. She might develop complicated grief, where the normal healing process is blocked by guilt, anger, or trauma. She might blame herself for his death, construct narratives where if she'd been home, if she'd known about the order sooner, if she'd been stronger, she could have protected him. This guilt is irrational but common in traumatic loss, and without therapeutic intervention, it can become a core belief that shapes her entire self-concept. Major depressive disorder is almost inevitable in the aftermath. She's experienced multiple traumatic events, lost her father, discovered her identity as a construction, killed living beings, and has no apparent future beyond survival. Depression following trauma isn't a character flaw or weakness. It's a neurobiological response to overwhelming stress. Her serotonin system has been depleted by months of chronic stress. Her cortisol levels have been elevated to the point of toxicity. Her hippocampus has likely shrunk from prolonged fear states. These are physical changes in brain structure and chemistry that create the symptoms we recognize as depression, persistent sad mood, loss of interest in activities, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, difficulty concentrating, and recurrent thoughts of death. Heather will likely experience all of these once the adrenaline fades and her nervous system tries to recalibrate to non-emergency functioning. The anger that sustained her through the game's latter half will need somewhere to go once Claudia is dead and the order is defeated. Anger doesn't simply disappear when its target is removed. It either finds new targets or turns inward. Heather might develop an anger problem, explosive outbursts at minor frustrations, difficulty controlling her temper, a hair-trigger rage response to perceived threats. This is common in complex PTSD, where the nervous system remains in a state of heightened arousal, interpreting neutral stimuli as threatening and responding with disproportionate aggression. Alternatively, the anger might turn inward, becoming self-directed rage that manifests as self-harm, suicidal ideation, or a pervasive belief that she deserved what happened to her. Either trajectory is concerning and requires intervention. The existential crisis of her identity will create ongoing psychological distress. Who is Heather Mason if her entire life was a construction meant to hide her from a cult? Who is Cheryl if that identity was just a fragment that ceased to exist when Alessa merged with her. Who is Alessa if that girl died 17 years ago and was reborn as someone new? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical psychological problems that affect Heather's ability to function. She can't establish a coherent sense of self because her self is genuinely fragmented, and without a stable identity, everything else becomes uncertain. Can she trust her preferences if they might be Alessa's preferences? Are her fears her own or inherited? When she makes decisions, who is making them? This kind of identity confusion creates paralysis, an inability to commit to choices or directions because she doesn't know which version of herself should be making the decision. The paranoia that develops from being hunted by a cult will likely generalize into broader paranoid thinking. She spent the game being tracked, manipulated, attacked by people who knew more about her than she knew about herself. That experience creates lasting hypervigilance and suspiciousness. She might develop paranoid personality traits, interpreting neutral actions as threatening, believing people have hidden motives, struggling to trust anyone. This isn't delusional paranoia, it's not psychosis, but it's a consistent pattern of suspicious thinking that makes relationships impossible. Who can she trust when the last group that claimed to care about her was actually trying to use her body as a divine incubator? How can she distinguish between genuine friendship and manipulation when she's learned that even her father, who loved her truly, lied to her about her nature? Social isolation becomes likely given her complete lack of support network and the impossibility of explaining her experiences to anyone who wasn't there. She can't talk about what happened without sounding delusional. She can't seek therapy without the therapist either dismissing her experiences as psychotic symptoms or believing her and facing their own psychological crisis about the nature of reality. She can't maintain friendships when she's constantly hypervigilant, when she dissociates unexpectedly, and when nightmares keep her from sleeping and flashbacks interrupt normal activities. Isolation exacerbates all her other symptoms. Depression worsens without social connection. PTSD becomes more entrenched without external reality checks. And grief grows more complicated without people to share memories and receive support. Substance use becomes a risk factor. Many trauma survivors self-medicate with alcohol or drugs to manage PTSD symptoms, to suppress nightmares, to numb emotional pain, to create temporary relief from hypervigilance. Heather has no healthy coping mechanisms, no therapy, no medication, no support system. If substances provide even temporary relief, the temptation to use them becomes strong. Addiction doesn't happen because people are weak. It happens because substances genuinely do reduce suffering in the short term, and when you're suffering constantly with no other relief available, short-term solutions become desperately appealing even when you know they create long-term problems. Sleep disorders are virtually guaranteed. PTSD and sleep are incompatible. Nightmares disrupt sleep architecture. Hypervigilance prevents the relaxation necessary for sleep onset, and trauma memories often surface in the vulnerable state between waking and sleeping. Heather will likely develop insomnia, lying awake for hours unable to quiet her mind, or hypersomnia, sleeping excessively to escape consciousness but never feeling rested because the sleep is fragmented and nightmare-ridden. Chronic sleep deprivation worsens every other psychiatric symptom, makes emotional regulation harder, impairs cognitive function, and increases suicide risk. It's a vicious cycle where trauma prevents sleep and sleep deprivation worsens trauma symptoms. Eating disorders might develop as a way to exert control over her body after experiencing profound loss of bodily autonomy. She had a god gestating inside her without her consent. Her body was being used for purposes she didn't agree to, and vomiting it out was a violent reclamation of her physical self. That experience might create ongoing issues with eating, either restrictive eating as a way to maintain control over what enters her body, or binge eating followed by purging as a reenactment of the vomiting that freed her from the god. Eating disorders aren't really about food, they're about control and coping, and Heather has every psychological reason to need both. The somatic symptoms that trauma creates will manifest as unexplained physical problems. PTSD lives in the body, creating chronic pain, digestive issues, headaches, muscle tension, and fatigue that have no clear medical cause but are very real to the person experiencing them. Heather might develop chronic pain syndromes, her body remembering the trauma that her mind is trying to suppress. She might experience functional neurological symptoms like tremors, weakness, or sensory disturbances that emerge during stress. These aren't imaginary, they're neurological responses to psychological trauma, the body expressing what the mind can't process. The ending of Silent Hill 3 is presented as victory. The god is destroyed, the order is defeated, and Heather walks away alive. But from a psychiatric perspective, this isn't an ending, it's a beginning. The real horror starts after the game fades to black, when Heather has to figure out how to live with what she's experienced, what she's learned, what she's lost. The monsters are dead, but the trauma they represent is permanent. The other world has retreated, but the psychological wounds it inflicted will take years to heal, if they heal at all. Heather Mason is 17 years old with a diagnostic profile that would overwhelm most adult psychiatric patients. She has dissociative identity disorder, or the supernatural equivalent, complex PTSD from inherited trauma, acute PTSD from recent traumatic events, prolonged grief disorder from her father's murder, probable major depressive disorder developing post-trauma, paranoid personality features from being hunted, hypervigilance and exaggerated startle response, intrusive memories and flashbacks, emotional numbing and dissociative episodes, anger dysregulation, identity confusion at an existential level, social isolation, high risk for substance abuse and eating disorders, sleep disturbance, and somatic symptoms. This is a level of psychiatric burden that would qualify for intensive outpatient treatment, at minimum, possibly inpatient stabilization, if suicidal ideation becomes active. But here's the element that makes Heather's portrayal genuinely exceptional in horror gaming. None of these symptoms are presented as her being crazy or broken. They're presented as reasonable responses to unreasonable circumstances. She's not mentally ill because she's weak or defective. She's experiencing psychiatric symptoms because she's endured trauma that would destroy most people, and she's still standing. The game never mocks her symptoms, never uses them as comedy, never presents her struggles as character flaws. Instead, it shows her fighting through dissociation, pushing past hypervigilance, weaponizing her rage, and surviving despite every psychiatric symptom trying to shut her down. This is a representation that respects the reality of mental illness while also portraying the strength required to function despite it. The game also demonstrates something clinicians know, but general audiences often miss. Trauma responses are not always sympathetic. Heather isn't always likable. She's abrasive, sarcastic, sometimes cruel in her internal monologue. She makes violent threats, expresses desire to cause suffering, and shows minimal empathy for people who aren't directly helping her. These aren't character flaws, they're trauma responses. Hypervigilance makes you suspicious and hostile. Chronic stress makes you irritable and short-tempered. Loss and grief make you focus inward on survival at the expense of social niceties. Heather behaves in ways that are understandable given her circumstances, but not necessarily pleasant, and that complexity makes her feel human rather than a carefully constructed sympathetic victim. The dark humor she employs throughout the game is a coping mechanism that deserves specific examination. When she finds a door that requires a key, she might say something sarcastic about how convenient that is. When she examines a disturbing object, she makes a joke to diffuse the horror. This constant internal commentary serves a psychological function. It prevents silence, and silence is where traumatic thoughts surface. By keeping her internal monologue active and somewhat detached, she's maintaining distance from the full emotional impact of her situation. It's avoidance, one of the core symptom clusters of PTSD, but it's also effective coping in the moment. The problem is that avoidance prevents processing, so while her humor keeps her functional during the crisis, it also ensures that the trauma will surface later when her defenses are down. Her interactions with Douglas Cartland reveal her attachment difficulties and trust issues. Douglas is genuinely trying to help her, feels guilty for his role in putting her in danger, and repeatedly offers assistance. Heather consistently refuses, pushes him away, and treats his offers with suspicion. This isn't her being unreasonable. It's complex PTSD creating attachment avoidance. She's learned through Alessa's memories that adults are dangerous, that authority figures betray, that trusting people gets you hurt. Douglas might be sincere, but Heather's trauma-informed threat assessment can't accept that possibility. Better to remain alone and hypervigilant than to trust and be betrayed. This is lonely and makes survival harder, but it's psychologically logical given her history. Her treatment of Vincent also demonstrates her black and white thinking, a cognitive distortion common in trauma survivors. Vincent gives her information that could help her, attempts to explain the Order's internal conflicts, and positions himself as someone caught in the same system she's fighting. But because he's part of the Order, Heather treats him with suspicion and hostility. There's no nuance, no consideration that someone might have complicated motives or might be trapped in circumstances beyond their control. You're either with her or against her, safe or threat, ally or enemy. This cognitive splitting is a defense mechanism that simplifies a complex world into manageable categories, but it also prevents her from seeing potential allies or understanding the human complexity of the people around her. Everyone becomes a chess piece rather than a person, which is psychologically protective but morally isolating. When Claudia kills Vincent for his perceived betrayal, Heather witnesses yet another death tied to the Order's internal violence. She doesn't intervene, doesn't mourn him, shows no visible reaction to watching someone be executed in front of her. This emotional flatness represents dissociative numbness, her capacity for empathy and horror exhausted by sustained trauma. She's witnessed so much death across these 12 hours that one more body doesn't register emotionally. This numbing is a protective mechanism but also a concerning symptom. When you stop reacting to violence and death, when human suffering becomes background noise, you've crossed into territory where your emotional responses are fundamentally altered. The Vincent she might have become allies with under different circumstances dies while she watches with the same detached expression she uses to examine locked doors. Complete shutdown of appropriate emotional response to witnessing murder. The game's exploration of bodily autonomy and reproductive horror deserves specific attention from a psychiatric perspective. Heather's body contains a god she didn't consent to carry, a pregnancy that isn't pregnancy but shares the violation of having your body used for purposes beyond your control. This is trauma specifically tied to being female, to having a body that can be impregnated, to the vulnerability that reproductive capacity creates. When she vomits the god out, it's not just defeating an enemy, it's reclaiming her body from a forced pregnancy metaphor. The relief and horror she experiences during that scene, the visceral disgust combined with the empowerment of expelling the invader, mirrors how many people experience ending unwanted pregnancies or escaping reproductive coercion. The game handles this with surprising sensitivity, never making it titillating or comedic, presenting it as genuinely traumatic body horror that Heather has to endure and survive. The religious dimension adds another layer of psychological complexity. Heather is fighting against a religion that views her body as sacred, as the chosen vessel, as the most important element in their entire cosmology. The Order worships her, but their worship is violation. They honor her by using her. They revere her by denying her autonomy. This creates a specifically religious trauma where faith and violation become inseparable. If Heather ever tries to explore spirituality in her future, she'll carry the knowledge that religious devotion tried to destroy her, that sacred language was used to justify torture, that worship can be a weapon. This is spiritual abuse, and it leaves scars that therapy often struggles to address because so much of religious experience is internal and subjective, making it hard to separate healthy faith from traumatic indoctrination. The generational trauma that flows from Alessa through Cheryl to Heather demonstrates how suffering echoes across lifetimes. Alessa's mother burned her. Heather's father was murdered by the same cult, the same suffering, the same betrayals, playing out across different bodies and different decades. This is more than metaphor. It's accurate to how trauma functions in families and communities. Children of abuse survivors often show PTSD symptoms despite never experiencing the original trauma, raised by parents whose nervous systems are calibrated to danger, learning hypervigilance and mistrust as normal baseline states. Heather didn't experience Alessa's burning, but she carries the psychological aftermath in her very structure, and that inheritance shapes who she becomes, how she perceives threats, and what coping mechanisms she develops. The game asks whether Heather can break this cycle, whether she can be something other than a victim or a vessel or a weapon. The answer isn't clear because the game ends before she has time to discover who she is outside of the crisis. She spent 17 years as Harry's daughter, constructed identity, and 12 hours as Alessa's reincarnation fighting for survival, reactivity. She hasn't had time to be Heather on her own terms, self-determined identity. The post-game question is whether someone with this much trauma can ever truly be self-determined, or whether the wounds are so deep they define you more than any choice you make. Because you're still here, now we can get darker. We've examined the diagnosed conditions, the symptoms and presentations, the way Heather's psychiatric profile manifests through gameplay and narrative. But there's a layer beneath this, something the game implies but never states explicitly. The possibility that Heather isn't just experiencing trauma, but might be developing into something clinically different from baseline human psychology. The question isn't whether she has PTSD or dissociative symptoms. The question is whether extended exposure to Silent Hill's reality warping power, combined with inherited psychic abilities from Alessa, has created someone whose perception of reality is permanently altered in ways that go beyond trauma into something that might be psychosis or might be genuine supernatural ability. Throughout the game, Heather perceives things others don't. She sees the otherworld transition while Douglas remains in normal reality. She senses the presence of the God inside her. She has intuitions about where to go and what to do that seem to come from nowhere. Are these Alessa's memories guiding her, or is she developing genuine precognitive or psychic abilities that allow her to perceive realities other people can't access? From a psychiatric perspective, there's no objective way to distinguish between psychic ability and psychosis. Both involve perceiving things others don't perceive. Both create conviction in experiences that can't be externally verified. Both make the person seem disconnected from shared reality. If Heather tries to explain her experiences to a psychiatrist, she'll meet criteria for schizophrenia or psychotic disorder. She hears the voice of Alessa sometimes, experiences visual and auditory hallucinations of monsters and otherworld transitions, has delusions about cults and gods and reincarnation. The fact that these experiences are real within the game's universe doesn't change how they would be evaluated clinically. Psychosis is defined as loss of contact with reality, but if your reality genuinely includes things others can't perceive, how does that distinction function? Heather is in the impossible position of being truthful about her experiences while sounding delusional, being accurate while appearing psychotic, functioning in a reality that psychiatry doesn't have frameworks to address. The inherited memories create a specific diagnostic challenge. In dissociative identity disorder, different identity states have different memories, creating amnesia between switches. Heather has the opposite problem. She has too many memories, multiple lifetimes of experiences compressed into one consciousness. This creates what might be called memory saturation, where she can't always distinguish which memories are from which identity state, which timeline she's currently accessing. She might remember being 7 years old in Harry's care and simultaneously remember being 7 years old burning in Dahlia's ritual. These memories don't contradict because they're both true for different identity fragments, but trying to hold them simultaneously creates cognitive dissonance that most brains aren't equipped to manage. The question of whether she's Heather or Alessa or something new doesn't have a clear psychiatric answer because the situation doesn't have a clear ontological answer. Philosophically, if you have someone else's complete memories and their trauma responses and their abilities and their fears, at what point do you become them rather than yourself? This is the ship of Theseus problem applied to identity. If every part of Heather contains some element of Alessa, is she still Heather, or has Heather ceased to exist? This isn't academic philosophy for her. It's an existential psychiatric crisis that affects her ability to function daily. The integration process she'll need to undergo if she pursues psychiatric treatment will be complicated by the fact that her identity fragmentation has both psychological and metaphysical dimensions. Standard therapy for dissociative identity disorder involves helping the different identity states communicate, reducing amnesia between them, and eventually integrating them into a cohesive whole. But Heather's identity states aren't just psychological constructs. They're literally different people whose souls merged. Can therapy integrate what metaphysics has split? Can medication help when the problem isn't neurotransmitter imbalance but supernatural violation of personal boundaries? The pharmacological treatment options for her conditions are limited. Antidepressants might help with depression and some PTSD symptoms, reducing intrusive thoughts and emotional numbing. Anti-anxiety medications might reduce hypervigilance, but there's no medication for dissociative identity disorder, no pill that integrates fragmented selves. Treatment is primarily therapeutic, requiring a skilled trauma specialist willing to believe her experiences, or at least suspend disbelief enough to work within her framework. Finding such a therapist without revealing the supernatural elements seems impossible, but revealing them risks psychiatric hospitalization for psychosis. The hospitalization risk is real. If Heather presents to an emergency room reporting that she's the reincarnation of a cult victim, that she has a god inside her, that she's being hunted by religious zealots who want to use her body to birth their deity, she'll be admitted involuntarily for psychiatric evaluation. She'll be medicated with antipsychotics to treat her delusions, held for 72 hours or longer, evaluated by psychiatrists who will diagnose her with schizophrenia or brief psychotic disorder. Her truthful account of her experiences will be documented as evidence of severe mental illness, and she'll be trapped in a system that can't distinguish between psychosis and supernatural reality. This creates a cruel bind. The help she needs requires honesty, but honesty will result in treatment that pathologizes her reality rather than addressing her actual trauma. The isolation this creates is total. She can't talk to mental health professionals without being diagnosed as psychotic. She can't talk to friends or peers without sounding delusional. She can't share her experiences with anyone who wasn't there, and everyone who was there is dead or enemy. This is profound alienation, being trapped in a reality you can't share, carrying experiences you can't explain, living with trauma that has no witness. The only people who might understand are other survivors of Silent Hill encounters, but finding them without exposing herself to the Order's remnants is nearly impossible. There might be support groups for people who've experienced supernatural trauma, underground networks of survivors who help each other navigate the psychiatric and practical challenges of living after impossible events. But accessing those networks requires admitting what happened, which creates vulnerability. If the Order has any remaining members, they'll be watching for signs of Heather surfacing. Any attempt to connect with others who understand risks revealing her location. The paranoia this creates is reasonable rather than pathological. She has to hide, has to assume threats exist, has to interpret neutral events as potentially dangerous because the consequences of being wrong are catastrophic. This is adaptive paranoia, where suspicious thinking is proportional to actual threat level. But adaptive paranoia and pathological paranoia create identical symptoms, identical hypervigilance, identical inability to trust, identical social isolation. The fact that her paranoia is justified doesn't make it less destructive to her well-being. The developmental disruption she's experienced complicates her trajectory further. 17 is a critical age for identity formation, where teenagers normally separate from parental figures, establish independent values, and begin forming adult identities. Heather's development has been violently derailed. She can't separate from Harry because he's dead. She can't establish independent values because her entire value system is now defined by opposition to the Order. She can't form adult identity because she doesn't know which identity to form, Heather's, Cheryl's, or Alessa's. This developmental arrest means she's psychologically stuck at 17 even as she ages chronologically, unable to progress through normal developmental stages because the foundation is too fractured. The survivor's guilt will emerge once the immediate crisis fades. Harry died protecting her. Claudia died giving birth to the god. Douglas was injured helping her. Vincent was potentially killed by her choice, or died at the Order's hands. Multiple people are dead because of her existence, because the Order wanted her specifically, because she's the reincarnation they needed. This isn't rational guilt. She didn't choose to be Alessa's reincarnation, didn't ask for the Order's attention, but guilt isn't rational. It's an emotional conviction that you're responsible for harm regardless of actual causation. Survivor's guilt can be as debilitating as direct trauma. creating beliefs like I should have died instead, or I don't deserve to be alive when others aren't, that fuel depression and suicidal ideation. The question of meaning haunts trauma survivors, trying to make sense of suffering, to find purpose in pain. Heather has to confront the possibility that everything she endured was meaningless, that the order's theology is false, that there's no cosmic purpose to Alessa's burning or her own suffering. This existential void can be more frightening than the trauma itself. If the pain meant something, if it served a purpose, however terrible, there's at least narrative coherence. But if it was all just cruelty and delusion, if Alessa burned for nothing and Heather fought for a God that was never divine, but just a psychological parasite, then the suffering is absurd. Existential therapy deals with this kind of meaning crisis, but it requires confronting the possibility that suffering is random and purposeless, which is a confrontation that can trigger severe depression. The body keeps the score, to use Bessel van der Kolk's phrase, and Heather's body will remember what her mind tries to suppress. She'll experience trauma anniversaries where symptoms intensify on the calendar date of Harry's death or the night she spent in Silent Hill. She'll have physical reactions to sensory triggers, her heart racing at the sound of air raid sirens, her stomach clenching at the smell of rust, her muscles tensing in fluorescent lit spaces that remind her of the mall. These somatic flashbacks don't feel like memories. They feel like the trauma is happening again right now, and they can occur without conscious awareness of what triggered them. She might be walking through a store and suddenly feel overwhelming panic without understanding that the lighting pattern matches the otherworld hospital. The hypervigilance will exhaust her nervous system. You can't maintain constant threat surveillance without burning out, but turning off hypervigilance feels dangerous when threats have been real and persistent. This creates a no-win situation where staying vigilant causes exhaustion and physical breakdown, but relaxing feels like inviting danger. Many trauma survivors get trapped in this bind, unable to rest but unable to sustain alertness, oscillating between anxious hyperarousal and exhausted collapse without finding a middle ground. The nightmares will be the most persistent symptom, harder to treat than almost any other PTSD manifestation. Nightmare rescripting therapy can help, where you reimagine the nightmare with a different ending while awake, but it requires consistent practice and often provides only partial relief. Medications can suppress REM sleep and reduce nightmare frequency, but they have side effects and don't address the underlying trauma. Heather will likely experience chronic sleep deprivation from nightmare avoidance, staying awake as long as possible because sleep means confronting the other world again, means watching her father die again, means feeling the God moving inside her again. Sleep becomes the enemy, and chronic insomnia becomes a new trauma layered on top of the original ones. The identity fragmentation creates practical problems beyond psychological distress. Which name does she use? Heather is the identity Harry gave her, but it's false. Cheryl is the name from before, but that child merged with Alessa and arguably doesn't exist anymore. Alessa is the original, but claiming that name feels like erasing Heather entirely. Legal documents say Heather Mason, but that identity feels like a costume now. Using different names in different contexts creates confusion and makes it harder to establish consistent identity. But choosing one name feels like murdering the others. This isn't abstract philosophy. It affects job applications, social security, bank accounts, every system that requires a stable legal identity. The employment challenges she'll face are substantial. She has no high school diploma because she was on the run. She has no work history. She has PTSD symptoms that make regular employment difficult, can't tolerate crowded spaces, might dissociate during stressful interactions, needs flexibility for therapy appointments and mental health crises. Minimum wage jobs rarely provide the accommodation she needs, and higher paying careers require education she can't pursue while managing severe psychiatric symptoms. Economic instability exacerbates all her other problems, creating a cycle where mental illness prevents employment and unemployment worsens mental illness. The relationship difficulties will isolate her further. Romantic relationships require vulnerability, trust, and emotional availability, all things her trauma has made nearly impossible. She might develop anxious attachment, clinging desperately to anyone who shows interest because losing them feels like losing Harry again. Or she might develop avoidant attachment, pushing people away before they can abandon or betray her, repeating the pattern where she rejects Douglas's help. Either attachment style creates relationship failure, confirming her belief that she's unlovable or that people are untrustworthy. Friendships fail similarly. She can't explain her history honestly, can't maintain consistent social presence when dissociating or having flashbacks, can't engage in normal activities when hypervigilance makes everything feel dangerous. The substance use risk increases with each failed attempt at conventional coping. If therapy doesn't help because therapists don't believe her, if medications don't work because the problem isn't purely biochemical, if sleep won't come and nightmares won't stop and hypervigilance won't fade, substances become more appealing. Alcohol suppresses nightmares temporarily and reduces hypervigilance. Cannabis might help with sleep and anxiety. Stronger substances might provide the dissociation she needs to function. The trajectory from occasional use for symptom relief to dependence is quick when you're self-medicating untreated PTSD. Addiction specialists recognize this pattern. Trauma survivors using substances to manage symptoms the psychiatric care hasn't adequately addressed, but recognizing it doesn't always prevent it. The dissociative episodes will create gaps in her awareness that are frightening and dangerous. She might lose time, coming to awareness hours later, in a different location with no memory of how she got there. She might switch between identity states and act in ways that contradict her usual patterns. Alessa's rage emerging unexpectedly, or Cheryl's childlike fear taking over during stress. These episodes can result in dangerous situations, driving during a dissociative state, entering unsafe locations without awareness, saying things that damage relationships without remembering the conversation. The unpredictability of dissociation makes it one of the most frightening symptoms, because you can't trust your own continuity of consciousness. The medical trauma from her experiences will make healthcare avoidance likely. The hospital otherworld was among the most disturbing environments in the game. Medical equipment as torture devices, examination rooms as violation chambers. This creates associations where hospitals, doctors, and medical procedures all trigger trauma responses. She might avoid necessary medical care because clinical settings trigger flashbacks. She might refuse examinations that feel invasive. She might have panic attacks during routine appointments. Medical trauma is particularly insidious because avoiding health care creates genuine health risks, but seeking health care means confronting triggers. The trust issues with authority figures will extend beyond medical professionals to police, teachers, therapists, any figure who holds institutional power. The order was an institution that used its authority to torture children and murder dissenters. That experience teaches that institutions are dangerous, that official positions don't guarantee good intentions, that people in power often serve systems rather than individuals. This makes it nearly impossible for Heather to engage with systems that might help her: social services, disability support, victim compensation programs, all of which require trusting institutional authority she has every reason to distrust. The chronic shame she carries from Alessa's experiences will poison her self-concept. Sexual abuse survivors often experience profound shame, believing they're dirty, damaged, fundamentally ruined by what was done to them. Alessa was abused, was impregnated with a god, had her body used in ways that violated every boundary. Those shame responses transfer to Heather through the shared memories and identity fusion. She might believe she's contaminated, might feel disgust toward her own body, might struggle with intimacy because physical touch triggers shame responses tied to Alessa's abuse. This shame isn't rational or deserved, but shame never is. It's a trauma response that persists regardless of intellectual understanding. The anger issues will manifest in ways that damage her remaining relationships. Trauma-related rage is different from normal anger. It's explosive, disproportionate, and often directed at people who don't deserve it. Heather might snap at someone who asks innocent questions, might destroy property during anger outbursts, might say cruel things when triggered. This anger alienates people, confirms her belief that she's unlovable or damaged, and creates cycles of rage and regret that worsen depression. Anger management techniques help, but they're less effective when the anger is trauma-driven rather than learned behavior. The suicidal ideation will likely intensify during the first year post-trauma, the period of highest suicide risk for PTSD survivors. The immediate survival threat is gone, which paradoxically makes suicide more likely because the crisis that demanded continued fighting has passed. What's left is grief, trauma, isolation, and a future that looks like decades of managing psychiatric symptoms with minimal support. The question becomes whether continuing to live is worth the suffering it requires, and that question doesn't have an obvious answer when you're 17, with no family, no support, severe PTSD, and an identity crisis that might never resolve. The lack of closure around Harry's death complicates the grief. She never saw his body. She learned about his death from an enemy who might have been lying. She couldn't attend a funeral, couldn't have a ritual goodbye, couldn't process the loss in traditional ways. Ambiguous loss is particularly difficult to grieve because there's no definitive moment of ending, no proof that creates emotional finality. Part of her might believe Harry is still alive, might expect him to appear, might interpret neutral events as signs he survived. This prevents grief from progressing through normal stages because she's stuck in denial, unable to accept a death she didn't witness. The complicated relationship with violence she's developed will create moral injury. Heather killed living beings, some in clear self-defense, others in situations where the threat was ambiguous, or where her rage drove actions beyond necessity. She has to integrate the identity of someone who's taken life, has to incorporate that into her self-concept. This creates moral injury, the damage to one's ethical framework from participating in actions that violate deeply held beliefs. She might have believed she wasn't capable of killing, and discovering that she is creating a crisis about who she fundamentally is. This moral injury is distinct from PTSD, but often occurs alongside it, creating an additional layer of psychological suffering. The fear that she'll be hunted forever will prevent her from settling anywhere or building lasting connections. The order might have remnants. Claudia had followers. The cult's theology centers on Heather's importance, so even defeated they might regroup and search for her. This creates a fugitive mentality where she can't stay in one place, can't use consistent names, can't establish roots because doing so creates vulnerability. This rootlessness prevents healing because trauma recovery requires safety, And you can't feel safe when you're constantly moving, constantly hiding, constantly waiting for the next attack. The religious questioning she'll experience might lead her toward or away from spirituality in extreme ways. Some trauma survivors find comfort in faith, interpreting their survival as divine intervention or finding meaning in religious frameworks. Others reject religion entirely, unable to separate spirituality from the cult that tortured them. Heather might oscillate between both, desperately wanting to believe in something benevolent while being triggered by any religious imagery or language. This spiritual homelessness, unable to find comfort in faith or secularism, creates existential loneliness. The generational curse she's inherited isn't just metaphorical. Epigenetics research shows that trauma changes gene expression in ways that can be inherited, meaning Alessa's suffering might have literally altered Heather's biology. If Heather ever has children, she might pass on trauma-altered genes that make them more vulnerable to PTSD, depression, or anxiety. This creates a terrible possibility that her trauma will echo into future generations, that Alessa's burning will affect people not yet born. Breaking this cycle requires intensive trauma treatment before having children, if she has them at all, and given her circumstances, that treatment seems unlikely. The way trauma distorts time perception will make every day feel endless and every year feel instant. PTSD keeps you trapped in the traumatic moment, reliving it repeatedly, so it never truly becomes past. Simultaneously, the years blur together because you're not creating new meaningful memories, just surviving day to day. Heather might wake up 5 years post Silent Hill and realize she can't account for where that time went, just a blur of hypervigilance and nightmares and dissociation without progress or growth. This temporal distortion is disorienting and contributes to the sense that you're not truly alive, just existing in a trauma-induced stasis. The positive symptoms she might develop, hallucinations or delusions emerging from prolonged PTSD and dissociation, could push her into psychotic territory that's harder to treat. She might start seeing otherworld manifestations even when not in Silent Hill, her traumatized brain recreating the horror in new environments. She might develop paranoid delusions beyond reasonable suspicion, believing everyone is order, that the God is still inside her, that reality itself is otherworld and there's no escape. These psychotic features would require antipsychotic medication, but such medications might not work if the symptoms have both psychological and supernatural components. The loss of future self is a grief that doesn't get discussed enough. Heather had some vision of who she might become, maybe vague adolescent dreams of career or relationships or simply being happy. That future person is dead, killed as surely as Harry was. The life she might have lived ended the moment she stepped into Silent Hill's influence. She's left mourning not just who she was, but who she'll never become, all the potential selves that trauma has made impossible. This anticipatory grief for futures that will never exist is as painful as grief for actual losses. The physical health consequences of chronic stress will accumulate. Prolonged cortisol elevation damages cardiovascular systems, immune function, and brain structure. She's at higher risk for heart disease, autoimmune disorders, diabetes, and neurological problems. Trauma literally shortens lifespan through these mechanisms, meaning even if she survives the psychiatric symptoms, her body is aging prematurely from stress. This creates cruel irony where she escapes Silent Hill only to die decades early from the physical toll of survival. The re-traumatization risk remains high because PTSD makes you vulnerable to additional traumas. Hypervigilance exhausts your threat detection systems. making you less effective at actual danger assessment. Dissociation means you might not notice genuine threats until too late. Isolation means you lack social support that might prevent dangerous situations. Statistically, trauma survivors are at elevated risk for additional traumatic experiences, not because they're careless, but because trauma itself creates vulnerabilities that predators and dangerous situations exploit. That explains why the Order targeted her, why Claudia could manipulate her so effectively. She was vulnerable in ways that normal 17-year-olds aren't, carrying trauma that made her readable and exploitable, but it doesn't explain why breaking free from the Order might not actually free her, why psychological chains might bind tighter than the cult ever could. The answer is a lot more uncomfortable. The psychiatric reality is that Heather might never recover. Not every trauma survivor heals. Not every PTSD case responds to treatment. Some people carry their wounds for life, managing symptoms but never achieving remission. With Heather's diagnostic complexity, the severity of her trauma, her complete lack of support system, and the supernatural dimensions that complicate conventional treatment, the possibility that she'll struggle with these symptoms for decades or life is substantial. This isn't pessimism. It's honest acknowledgement that some damage is permanent, some suffering doesn't resolve, and survival doesn't guarantee healing. The question becomes what quality of life is possible when healing isn't. Can someone with severe chronic PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, and complicated grief still have meaningful existence? The answer is complicated. Many trauma survivors build lives around their symptoms, finding careers that accommodate their limitations, relationships with people who understand their needs, coping strategies that make symptoms manageable if not absent. But that requires resources Heather doesn't have: economic stability, social support, access to trauma-informed care, safety from ongoing threats. Without those foundations, her prognosis is guarded at best. The developmental trajectory for someone with her profile typically involves multiple hospitalizations, medication trials, therapy approaches of varying effectiveness, periods of stability interrupted by crises, and gradual accumulation of skills for managing symptoms. Best case scenario with intensive treatment, she achieves what's called functional recovery, where symptoms persist but don't prevent employment, relationships, or basic life satisfaction. More likely, given her lack of resources, she experiences chronic psychiatric disability, unable to maintain employment or housing stability, cycling through crisis services and emergency interventions without sustained improvement. The worst case scenario is death by suicide, and with her risk factors, that outcome is statistically more likely than full recovery. Young trauma survivors with multiple diagnoses, no support system, and recent major losses represent the highest risk population for completed suicide. Heather has every risk factor: severe psychiatric symptoms, access to means, recent bereavement, social isolation, trauma history, and possibly developing psychotic features. Without intervention, the statistical probability that she'll survive the next 5 years is distressingly low. But statistics don't account for individual resilience, and Heather has demonstrated extraordinary resilience. She survived Silent Hill, she killed a god, she resisted the Order's manipulation and Claudia's indoctrination. She maintained functional cognition during dissociative crises and executed complex problem solving while managing severe PTSD symptoms. This isn't normal teenager capability. This suggests either exceptional baseline resilience or Alessa's inherited abilities providing psychological resources most people lack. That resilience might be what allows her to survive what statistics say she shouldn't. The inherited psychic abilities create an alternate possibility that psychiatric frameworks don't address. If Heather has genuine supernatural capabilities from Alessa, those abilities might offer coping mechanisms unavailable to neurotypical trauma survivors. She might develop conscious control over reality warping effects, creating safe spaces that the other world can't touch. She might learn to use dissociation productively, accessing Alessa's knowledge and skills when needed. She might connect with other psychically sensitive individuals who can provide understanding and support that conventional relationships can't. This supernatural recovery trajectory isn't something psychiatry can predict or facilitate, but it might exist parallel to conventional healing. The possibility that Silent Hill itself might call her back creates ongoing danger. The town has drawn multiple people over decades, and those who leave often return or find that Silent Hill follows them. If Heather settles somewhere and begins healing, the town might manifest around her, turning her new environment into otherworld. This would make recovery impossible, trapping her in permanent proximity to her trauma. The only escape might be constant movement, staying ahead of the town's influence, but that prevents the stability required for healing. She's trapped between staying still and risking re-traumatization, or moving constantly and preventing recovery. The meta-awareness that her suffering serves a narrative purpose creates existential horror beyond the psychiatric. In universe, she's a person experiencing trauma. Metatextually, she's a video game character whose suffering entertains players. This fourth wall awareness, if she had it, would create a unique form of existential crisis, where your pain is literally someone else's entertainment, where your trauma exists to create engagement. Thankfully, she doesn't have that awareness, but we do, and it complicates our relationship with her suffering. Are we examining her psychiatric symptoms to understand trauma better? Or are we engaging in intellectual voyeurism, treating her pain as fascinating rather than horrifying? The question of her agency throughout the game is psychiatrically relevant. How much of her behavior was genuine choice versus trauma-driven compulsion versus supernatural manipulation versus player control? When she chose to pursue Claudia, was that autonomous decision or revenge fixation overriding better judgment? When she killed the god, was that her will or Alessa's, or does that distinction even matter anymore? Agency requires stable identity and intact decision-making capacity, both of which are compromised in her case. This doesn't absolve her of responsibility for her actions, but it complicates the moral evaluation of her choices. The performative aspect of her toughness deserves examination. Heather presents as strong, sarcastic, unafraid, but this presentation might be defensive performance rather than genuine affective state. Trauma survivors often develop tough exteriors to prevent others from seeing their vulnerability, to avoid being perceived as victims, to maintain illusion of control. The constant sarcasm and bravado might be Heather's armor against a world that's proven itself hostile. When she's alone, when the performance drops, she might be terrified, grief-stricken, barely holding together. The game shows us the performance, but rarely the private moments, making it hard to assess her genuine emotional state beneath the defensive presentation. The way her appearance changes subtly throughout the game reflects her psychological deterioration. She starts relatively put together, then becomes progressively more disheveled, blood-stained, exhausted. This isn't just visual realism, it's an external manifestation of internal collapse. Her physical presentation reflects someone who stopped caring about appearance because basic survival overrides all other concerns. This self-neglect can persist post-trauma, where depression and PTSD make basic self-care feel impossible or pointless. She might continue looking disheveled months later, not because she lacks access to showers, but because the energy required for grooming exceeds what her depleted system can provide. The journals and notes she finds throughout the game often reflect her own psychological states, victims of the order describing suffering that mirrors Alessa's, descriptions of being hunted that parallel her own experience. This creates what psychologists call universalization, the recognition that your suffering isn't unique, that others have experienced similar horrors. This can be comforting, reducing isolation, or it can be devastating, confirming that suffering is common and escape is rare. For Heather, seeing evidence of the order's other victims might reinforce her mission or might create survivors' guilt about being the one who escapes when others didn't. The symbolic meaning of vomiting the god deserves deeper analysis. Vomiting is expulsion of poison, rejection of something that's sickening you, violent physical purging. The god represents Alessa's suffering transformed into divine purpose, the order's belief that pain is sacred. By vomiting it out, Heather is rejecting the narrative that suffering has meaning, that trauma is transformative, that pain serves a higher purpose. This is psychologically crucial, the refusal to let her abuse be reframed as necessary or meaningful. But vomiting is also loss of control, violent involuntary action, and the fact that this rejection happens through bodily revolt rather than conscious choice complicates the symbolism. She's rejecting the god, but her body is doing the work, suggesting the refusal is visceral and precognitive rather than an intellectual decision. The role of disgust in her trauma responses is significant. Disgust is a protective emotion that evolved to keep us from ingesting toxins or contracting disease. Trauma hijacks disgust, making things that shouldn't trigger it, intimacy, your own body, certain foods, become sources of intense revulsion. Heather's experience of having something growing inside her without consent would create profound disgust toward her own body, toward pregnancy generally, possibly toward sexuality and physical intimacy. This disgust might make romantic relationships impossible even if she could manage the trust issues, because physical closeness triggers visceral revulsion tied to the parasitic god. The way mirrors function in the game as portals between realities creates symbolic connection to identity fragmentation. Mirrors reflect who you are, but for Heather, mirrors show multiple realities, multiple versions of self. Looking in a mirror might trigger dissociative episodes where she's not sure which reflection is real, which version of herself is looking back. Mirror avoidance is common in trauma survivors, particularly those with body image issues or identity confusion, because the reflection is confrontational evidence of existence that feels wrong or fragmented. The maternal relationships or lack thereof define much of her psychological landscape. Dahlia was Alessa's mother and torturer. Heather has no mother in her Heather identity life. Claudia positions herself as a spiritual mother to the god. This absence and corruption of maternal figures creates attachment wounds, lack of secure base, lack of nurturing presence, lack of model for healthy femininity. Heather has to construct her own identity without maternal guidance, using Harry as her only parental reference. This might create gender identity complications or simply leave developmental gaps where maternal influence typically shapes emotional regulation and relationship patterns. The significance of her name choice, if she gets to choose post-game, reveals her psychological resolution. Keeping Heather suggests she's prioritizing the constructed identity Harry gave her, valuing the years of safety he provided over the metaphysical truth of her origin. Reclaiming Alessa suggests She's integrating the trauma rather than denying it, accepting that she is the reincarnation and that identity matters. Choosing Cheryl suggests she's trying to return to innocence, to the moment before trauma, which is psychologically regressive but understandable. Creating an entirely new name suggests she's rejecting all previous identities and attempting to build something autonomous, which shows agency but might indicate denial of her history. The clothing she wears, deliberately casual and covering, suggests body shame or desire for invisibility. Someone comfortable in their body might wear more revealing or attention-getting clothing. Heather's fashion choices suggest she wants to avoid notice, wants to hide her form, wants to blend rather than stand out. This is common in abuse survivors, using clothing as armor and camouflage. Post-trauma, she might continue this pattern, might struggle to wear anything that feels exposing, might experience anxiety if forced into situations requiring formal or revealing dress. The fact that she's 17 means she's still legally a minor in most jurisdictions, which creates practical complications. She can't sign rental agreements, can't access certain services, might be placed in foster care if authorities discover she's parentless. This legal vulnerability adds to her danger, giving systems power over her that she can't resist. She might have to hide her age along with her identity, pretending to be 18 to avoid state intervention, which creates additional stress and limits her options. The economic reality of her situation is dire. Harry presumably had some assets, but she can't access them without revealing her location and identity. She has no ID, no birth certificate she can safely use, no social security documentation. She's effectively undocumented, unable to participate in the legal economy. This forces her into cash-based work, informal economies, or potentially illegal activities. Economic desperation makes people vulnerable to exploitation, and Heather's combination of trauma symptoms and economic need creates high risk for trafficking, coercion, or abusive employment situations. The possibility of pregnancy from sexual assault during her ordeal is small but non-zero and would create catastrophic additional trauma. Someone who just expelled a divine fetus discovering she's pregnant from human assault would experience compounded reproductive horror. This seems unlikely given the game's timeline, but the fear of pregnancy might persist regardless, creating anxiety around bodily changes and need for confirming she's not pregnant. The relationship between her video game status and her symptoms creates interesting analytical questions. Video game protagonists typically have unlimited physical stamina, immediate healing from injury, perfect memory of control schemes. Heather has none of these advantages. She's exhausted, she's injured and stays injured, she struggles with the tools she finds. This mechanical weakness reflects her psychological state, the game making you feel her PTSD and dissociation through gameplay limitations rather than just narrative description. You fail to dodge attacks because she's too tired. You miss context clues because she's dissociating. The game mechanics are diagnostic tools. The healing items she uses, health drinks, and first aid kits, provide no psychiatric relief, only physical. There's no equivalent item for restoring mental health, reducing dissociation, managing hypervigilance. This absence is realistic. Psychological symptoms don't respond to quick fixes, but it also means the player experiences the full weight of her psychological burden without mitigation. You can restore her physical health to full, but she's still traumatized, still dissociating, still carrying all her psychiatric symptoms regardless of how many health drinks you consume. The save points represented as notepads might symbolize attempts to maintain continuity of identity and memory. Writing things down compensates for dissociative amnesia, creating external record when internal memory is unreliable. Heather might continue this practice post-game, journaling obsessively to maintain awareness of time passage and events, using written records to combat dissociation. This is actually therapeutic. Narrative exposure therapy uses writing about trauma as a treatment tool, but it only works if done in a therapeutic context with professional support. The singular, canonical ending, Heather's escape from Silent Hill after destroying the god, leaves her psychological fate open to interpretation, suggesting that recovery or deterioration depends on what happens after the screen fades to black, on actions and choices the game doesn't show us. This is psychologically accurate. Trauma outcomes aren't predetermined but depend on post trauma interventions, support systems, individual choices, and circumstances. Heather's future could go multiple directions, depending on what resources she accesses, what choices she makes, and what random factors intervene. The uncertainty is frightening, but also means hope is possible even for severe cases. The game's single canonical ending shows Heather walking away from Silent Hill, alive but forever changed. What happens next isn't depicted, leaving her psychological trajectory open to multiple possibilities. She might achieve some form of recovery if she finds resources and support, building a life around her symptoms rather than being consumed by them. Many trauma survivors do exactly this, channeling their experiences into meaning, finding purpose that makes continued existence worthwhile despite ongoing psychiatric symptoms. Or she might deteriorate, the trauma becoming unbearable once the immediate survival threat passes. The statistical reality that young trauma survivors with her risk factors face elevated suicide risk for years following the traumatic events. Without intervention, without support systems, without economic stability and access to trauma-informed care, her prognosis remains guarded. She might be drawn back to Silent Hill, either literally if the town calls to her again, or psychologically through the flashbacks and intrusive memories that characterize PTSD, returning to the traumatic material repeatedly as her mind tries to process what cannot be fully integrated. Or she might transform, her inherited abilities from Alessa evolving in ways that change her relationship to reality itself, becoming something beyond conventional psychiatric frameworks, powerful but isolated, capable but forever marked by what she's experienced and what she carries inside her fragmented identity. The uncertainty is what makes her case so diagnostically challenging. We can identify her symptoms and risk factors, but can't predict which trajectory she'll follow. Too many variables, her own choices, random circumstances, whether remnant order members find her, whether she accesses help, whether her resilience holds or breaks. What we can say with certainty is that Heather Mason, at age 17, has experienced more psychological trauma than most people experience in lifetimes. She carries diagnoses that would challenge the most skilled treatment teams: dissociative identity disorder with supernatural dimensions, complex PTSD from inherited trauma, acute PTSD from recent events, prolonged grief disorder, probable major depression, high suicide risk, paranoid features, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, emotional dysregulation, identity confusion at existential level, social isolation, high risk for substance abuse and eating disorders, sleep disturbance, somatic symptoms, and possible emerging psychotic features. She experienced parental loss, identity revelation that shattered her reality, forced pregnancy metaphor with divine parasite, sustained life threat across 12 hours, exposure to grotesque violence and body horror, betrayal by religious institutions, and requirements to commit violence herself. She has no support system, limited economic resources, and must hide from potential cult remnants while managing severe psychiatric symptoms. Her prognosis without treatment is poor. Her likelihood of achieving conventional recovery is low. The probability she'll struggle with these symptoms for years or decades is high. The risk of suicide is substantial and immediate, but she survived Silent Hill. She killed God with her bare hands and walked out alive. She has Alessa's psychic potential, Harry's love internalized as foundation, and resilience demonstrated through impossible circumstances. Maybe that's enough. Maybe survival isn't about healing completely, but about continuing to exist despite the wounds. Maybe recovery isn't reaching some pristine, pre-trauma state, but learning to live with the scars. Maybe Heather's victory isn't defeating her symptoms, but refusing to let them define her completely. The real horror of Heather Mason's story isn't the monsters, or the other world, or even the order. It's the psychiatric reality of trauma that doesn't end when the game does, suffering that continues in silence, damage that might never fully heal. It's the knowledge that 17-year-old girls in the real world carry similar burdens without supernatural explanations, cope with fragmented identities and inherited trauma and grief and PTSD while trying to build lives that feel worth living. Silent Hill 3 is a horror game masterpiece not because of its monsters, but because of its protagonist, because Heather's psychological portrayal is devastatingly accurate, because her symptoms and responses and deterioration all track with clinical reality. Team Silent understood that the most frightening thing isn't what chases you through fog-shrouded streets. It's what you carry inside your own mind, the ways your brain betrays you, the wounds that don't show but never stop bleeding. Heather Mason walks out of Silent Hill at the end of the game, but Silent Hill never leaves her. It's in her nightmares, and her flashbacks, and her hypervigilance, and her fractured identity. It's in the grief she can't process, and the rage she can't release, and the trauma she can't escape. It's in every mirror that might show the wrong reflection, every fluorescent light that flickers like otherworld transitions, every moment of dissociation where she's not sure which identity is looking through her eyes. She survived, but survival isn't victory when you're left with wounds that might never heal. That's the diagnosis. That's every mental disorder in Heather Mason, and that's why she might be the most tragic character in the franchise, not because of what was done to her, but because of what she'll carry forever.